Good afternoon, everybody. If you've been to any of our previous climate change related events, you know how excited I get about this. So I'm going to try to really tone it down today. But I was sitting next to Paul Chesser, and Paul said to me, that was a really great topic, a headline that you picked for the topic. Did you do that before ClimateGate or after? And guess what? It was before. I'm so proud of it. And it's changed even more. And I know that all of you right now are praying that it would change even more and at least get a little warmer than it is. So, yay to climate change. Paul has been one of my heroes. He really has. We haven't spoken very much over the past few years, but I have followed the great work that he's done for such a long time. I've been with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation going on 7 years now. I've written so much about climate change, and the work that Paul has done to set the foundation for sound science, for common sense when it comes to climate change policy has really been groundbreaking across the nation for the state-based think tanks. And Paul has the added advantage of living in North Carolina, which I don't know how many of you know, is the only state in the Southeast with a climate action plan. So he's living it. He's experiencing it. Paul is the director of the Climate Strategies Watch, and he'll be telling you so much about that. And he's with the Heartland Institute, which is an umbrella organization for Climate Strategies Watch. He's considered a top authority on climate change policy development on the state level and on regional initiatives, including the Western Climate Initiative, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. He's a contributing editor for the Carolina Journal. He specializes in investigative journalism and opinion writing there, and his articles have appeared in dozens of newspapers across the country, including the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, the San Francisco Examiner, the National Review Online, the Weekly Standard Online, the American Spectator, and World Magazine. And just the day before yesterday, he was in the New York Post. Yesterday, he was here testifying at a joint House Natural Resources and Energy Committee hearing talking about renewables portfolio standards, and he was the only voice in opposition. And I was really proud to have timed that so serendipitously, and my friends would say that's one of them $3 words. It was just great to have him. He's also responsible for exposing the secret work that the new Alliance for Climate Education was doing to infiltrate high schools with global warming alarmism. And you know how that kind of indoctrination goes. And they were trying to recruit students for their cause. He also exposed the involvement of the Western Governors Association in the Western Climate Initiative without the unanimous consent of their member governors, which is required by their bylaws. And he exposed plans by Virginia Governor Tim Kaine, chairman of the Southern Governors Association, to promote a Southern regional cap-and-trade plan at the annual Southern Governors Association meeting. So Paul knows all about the intrigue behind climate change policy and ClimateGate, and I'm so happy that we can hear it firsthand from him. Thank you, Paul, for coming.
I just want to say thank you to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. I come out of the state think tank movement. I started doing all this kind of work and being more of a general investigative reporter in North Carolina at the John Locke Foundation, which is the counterpart to GPPF here. And I just learned there how important these state think tanks are and how much they are the knowledge, the brain power behind the conservative movement, the free market limited government movement. They're very, very important. And GPPF the last couple of days have been great hosts, and just really encourage you to continue to support them. They've really I think I've gotten more business cards here the last 2 days than I have in any other place that I've visited. And these kind of dinners or lunches are usually called the chicken circuit, so I was pleasantly surprised to see beef come out on the plate today. So anyway, just to start with a disclaimer, as Benita obviously shared with you, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an economist, I'm not an energy specialist. A lot of you out there know a lot more about those different areas than I do. I'm an investigative reporter. I went in and my niche in this work has been digging around, finding out who's connected to who and who's financing the efforts, the advocacy efforts. So that's where I'm coming from. So don't expect me to be the expert on the science, although a lot of these components will be in my presentation. I wanted to start today with a little video clip that you may or may not have seen. How do I jump from the? Should I just escape out of it, or is there an easier way to do it? Okay. Okay. You recognize this this gentleman, and this is from the State of the Union speech. This has been a couple weeks ago now. Oh, that's right. And we're going to try to make this work by pushing the microphone up against the speaker. You think that'll do it?
I know that there are those who disagree with the overwhelming scientific evidence on climate change. But
were you all able to hear that? Yeah. Well, look at them. Why are they all laughing? We got quite an outburst of laughter there from the must have been several congressmen and women and Speaker Pelosi, and where is the? Oh, I know. I got it. So, after watching that, it made me wonder. This is from the Hooterville Gazette. They're the website that captured this video clip. When they all started laughing at President Obama, and looks right there, as you can see, that as the Hooterville Gazette has captured that snapshot in time, there it looks like they're all laughing. Even President Obama snickered when he made this statement. I know that there are those who disagree with the overwhelming scientific evidence on climate change. Why? What are they laughing about? I have a couple ideas that maybe we could choose from. Maybe he's following the mantra, laugh and the world laughs with you. Or maybe Vice President Biden and Speaker Pelosi are simultaneously goosing him. I mean, look at you. They are kind of concealed behind him there. Maybe it's a speech timing mechanism he employs right before he blames the last 8 years, as he so often wants to do. Or maybe he just doesn't really believe what he's saying, that there's an overwhelming scientific evidence about climate change. Well, let's explore here. Overwhelming scientific evidence over the last, dating back to the 90s has really meant, and what the alarmists and the advocates have said is they always reference back to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Global Climate Change, the IPCC. Whenever somebody says, okay, well, what is your scientific basis? Who is the scientific authority? You hear Al Gore talk about it's the consensus. This has always been their authority that they refer back to. Well, now that we've had ClimateGate, and if you're not familiar with ClimateGate, I'll refer back to it and explain a little more as we go along. We are now seeing the collapse of this as an authority, both with the revelation at the University of East Anglia in Great Britain, the Climate Research Unit, with the emails that were revealed and found and found to be that the scientists who were basically in control of the data and those who were in control of what went into the IPCC report were fudging data. It was, they found it in the background data of the stuff that was revealed, that there were fudge factors in the data. It was right there in the source code. There was an email that talked about hiding the decline, meaning hiding a decline in the global temperatures. this is some of the stuff that's come out as a result of climate change. And when they talk about the UN IPCC as the authority, they always talk about 2,500 scientists. Sometimes you'll see 4,000 scientists. It was really not thousands of scientists. There are hundreds of climate scientists and various scientists. They weren't even studying, what's providing the signal to affect temperature. They're talking about things like sea level rise and effects on coral reefs and that kind of thing. Nothing that has to do with what's got to do with temperature. When you look at the summary for policymakers, which is the document, the summary, kind of the executive summary of the report, there were only 52 of the people who were contributed to that summary that were actual scientists. The rest were bureaucrats, policy wonks, people with an agenda. So that's what the media always looks back to. They didn't start looking at the underlying scientific documentation until recently, until ClimateGate broke. So nevertheless, like I said, the media considered the UN IPCC report an overwhelming consensus that it was because it was peer-reviewed. The scientists were reviewing each other's findings and, allegedly looking at the science and making sure that things were done right, replicating it. That's what peer-reviewed means. It was their Bible, their authority, and that it was infallible. So can I hear an amen? No. Okay, I didn't think so from this crowd. So anyway, let's look at some of the overwhelming scientific evidence that was actually in the 2007, they call it the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. Here's one example of a statement, excuse me, that was in the report. This was a citation where they said the multiple stresses of climate change and increasing human activity on the Antarctic Peninsula represent a clear vulnerability and have necessitated the implementation of stringent clothing contamination guidelines for tourist landings on the Antarctic Peninsula. Sounds, pretty dire consequence of climate change here. Well, you see that reference there to the IAATO. What IAATO is the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, and it was from their boot cleaning manual. So this is one of the scientific papers that the IPCC was referring back to as peer-researched authority for proof of climate change. Anything but a paper by a scientist that was a good foundation for what the case they were trying to make. Here's another one, a statement said by another paper that they were referring to. And these were, the IPCC is a collection of scientific papers, research. Lots of different scientists reviewed different chapters, wrote chapters, and it all was compiled, and then they came out with a summary for policymakers. One of them said, by 2020 in some countries, yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%. Agricultural production, including access to food, in many African countries is projected to be severely compromised. This would further adversely affect food security and exacerbate malnutrition. Another pretty dire consequence. Until you look at who Mr. Ali Agumi is. He was writing for a publication produced by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is basically a Canadian version of the World Wildlife Fund. They're an advocacy group for sustainability. And he also does side work working for a carbon trading company. So he has a vested interest in seeing this cause advocated and advanced and promoted anything but an objective, peer-reviewed scientific report. This is the kind of stuff that they were allowing into the IPCC. This was not being examined until after ClimateGate broke, and not the American media, but the British media, which was also very much in the alarmist camp. They are jumping all over this, and they're now peeling into the layers underneath the IPCC and finding out, okay, who are they really citing here? And it's almost one a day that comes out that reveals that it was anything but serious peer-reviewed science. I'll just lay these all out. Some of the other things that they've discovered between the bloggers and between the British media in the IPCC, there were several advocacy group advocacy group citations. The World Wildlife Fund reports were cited 16 times. Greenpeace reports were cited 8 times. Another from a magazine called Climbing News. And you see the others. They're citing master's dissertations and press releases and newsletters. So hardly anything that's of serious scientific research there. Errors that they've discovered. GlacierGate, is probably the most popular one or well-known one that's come out. I always have to do that at least once during a talk. GlacierGate, where they messed up the year that they said that there would be significant glacier melt in the Himalayas. They were saying they would have significant melt by 2035. It should have been 2350, and it was from a World Wildlife Fund report. And Raj Pachauri, who is the head over the IPCC, knew about this before the Copenhagen conference in December, and he did not disclose it. He kept it hidden until after Copenhagen was over. This just came out in the last few weeks. They were using Chinese meteorological stations that had no history of their location or their relocations. In other words, temperature stations that captured temperature were moved, and they didn't have a background track record of where those had been moved from, whether they moved to a location that would have a warming bias, if they moved from a rural location or if a location had become more urbanized. That has an effect. Said 55% of the Netherlands is below sea level, when actually only 26% of the Netherlands is below sea level. So the risk of flooding was exaggerated in the report. And then there was Amazon Gate, in which they said up to 40% of rainforest could be affected by slight reductions in precipitation, but the source that they cited actually attributed that to logging. So flaws, errors, and so, I like this comment that I found on a blog that said, "What's the fuss? These are all peer-reviewed. After all, someone must have peered at them one time or another." That's what they call peer-reviewed science. So why is President Obama laughing? I would suggest that he really didn't believe what he was saying in the State of the Union address. The scientific evidence, as we know it today, what have we been seeing in the last decade or so? There's been no warming since 1998. One of the reasons for that is that was an El Nino year. It was an exceptionally warm year because of the El Nino patterns, wind patterns. But what's more significantly is that there's been no statistically significant warming since '95. It went up, and then it's kind of gone up and down. And since that time, we've not seen any warming, even though greenhouse gas emissions have continued upward. So the predictions and the forecasts that were in the modeling that the alarmist scientists have cited has not proven to come true. They talk about how especially after Katrina, how the hurricanes were going to be more frequent and more intense. We've not seen that. The polar bear population is higher today than in the 1950s. The polar bears are not endangered as a global species. Antarctica has cooled over the past 50 years, and ice coverage has grown since satellite monitoring began in 1979. Now, sometimes you'll see a report about Antarctica where it's losing ice. There is a peninsula that sticks out into the southern Pacific, I think it is, called the Wilkins Ice Shelf. There's volcanic activity underneath it. That's one of the explanations for it. But as far as the rest of Antarctica, it's been increased. And the Arctic ice, which has really been the driving force in the science behind the alarmism, Alaska has been losing coastline. It's been recovering over the last 3 years, and the reason that some scientists say that even up in the Arctic they were losing ice has to do with wind patterns. There's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation where just wind patterns shift and things are affected, and it's not unique to our current time. These things have happened before in the past. Some scientists say. So what do the alarmists want? Well, first of all, they're trying to salvage their cause. I mean, Time magazine came out within the last week saying all this blizzard activity we're seeing is because of global warming. They're trying to say, well, this is what we've been saying all along. These storms are greater intensity. This is global warming. They're largely getting laughed at because if you look at poll after poll after poll, I have not seen a poll in the last year plus in which either respondents have said this is the most important thing to them. It's always ranked 20th out of 20, 21st out of 21, or they're starting to say, well, they're in greater numbers are saying it's got more attributable to natural variation than to human causes. So what are the alarmists really after, though? They've been blocking coal-fired power plants in all the states. I mean, without exception. They want mountaintop. The next thing is mountaintop coal removal. They hate to see the mountaintops blown off so they can get at the coal. When in fact, sometimes these mountains are restored to greater habitat than they were before. Renewable portfolio standards, which means that utilities are required to get a minimum amount of their power generation from renewable sources like wind and solar. California tailpipe emission standards, in other words, you can't emit a certain amount of CO2 from tailpipes, and that they want that across the nation. They want the federal government actually to adopt that. Cap and trade, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. I cannot see that happening this year. The folks I've been talking to here, I think, are pretty much in agreement politically. This is an election year. Harry Reid's up for re-election, the Senate Majority Leader. They're just not going to go there. They can't even get health care passed. So why would they go for it on cap and trade? They may get something much less than that, but even that I think is in jeopardy. And they really want lots of government grant money for research. If you hear the mainstream media, they talk a lot about how the skeptics, or the deniers, like they call people like me, are in the back pockets of big oil. Their funding far surpasses any funding that the skeptic side has received. By billions of dollars in government research grants and those kinds of things, and foundation money, which I'll talk about in a minute, as opposed to the relative pittance that the other side has gotten. And big oil, as I'm saying, my next point here, they are after big oil money themselves, big time. That was revealed in some of the emails in the ClimateGate scandal, where one of the scientists said, BP is got this pot of money for whatever. Now, I'm paraphrasing, and they said, how can we get this steered to our research unit? So they're very hypocritical in criticizing on that, the skeptic side. So since they're unlikely to get cap and trade, I am predicting, or sort of becoming more aware once again, since last year is really focused on the federal level, I think they're going to have to revert back to sort of a semi-stealth approach at the state level. And this is where I entered into the whole deal, the whole issue, is that looking at what's going on at the state level with climate policy development. And just to introduce you to what I started looking into, you have to look at a group called the Center for Climate Strategies. They're born of an advocacy group out of Pennsylvania called the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and they were basically created as an outside nonprofit controlled totally by this advocacy group, and they were sent out to all the other states to try to get governors to buy into creating blue ribbon panels and appointing their members, and then turning the process, the stakeholder groups, over to Center for Climate Strategies and coming up with policy recommendations which all have to do with rationing energy, stopping fossil fuel development, and its use. So the strategy was really revealed in a video interview, which you can find on Google Video. You Google Tom Peterson Center for Climate Strategies, and the video 5-minute interview comes up, and he explains the strategy explicitly. He said, "We've been supporting the states in the formation of comprehensive climate action plans in all the policies that are involved in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all the different economic sectors in the economy, all the economic sectors, and we ultimately hope it will lead to national policies, and we hope even international agreements that can lead the nation forward in terms of addressing the global warming problem. And these guys were over at Copenhagen making the case for this approach. So who is CCS? Like I said, they're created by an advocacy group in Pennsylvania to export their alarmism. Most cases, they approach the executive branch. They go to the governor's office or his environmental cabinet person. And back when President Bush was still in office, they would say, look, the Bush administration, the EPA is not doing enough about climate change issue. It's up to the states, the laboratories for democracy, to come together, create their own policies, and then cluster together in regional agreements like the Western Climate Initiative, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, and put pressure on the federal government. And for the governors, when they, or their administrators would hear this, they would be very attracted to it, because what would happen is CCS would bring along a lot of private foundation money, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Ted Turner's Foundation, Teresa Heinz Kerry's Foundation, the Energy Foundation, all these huge foundations, multi-million-dollar foundations with this global warming alarmism agenda, and say, look, you don't have to pay for it, or you kick in $10,000 or $20,000, we'll pay for the rest. And CCS would collect $500,000 to do a process for each state. So they benefited. They got their agenda advanced, and for the governors, they said, "Well, no brainer. I can look like I'm doing something about global warming. It's not going to cost me anything. It only produces recommendations, and there you go." But politically, these things would go out, and they would, unbeknownst to many legislators at the time, they wouldn't know who this group was. They didn't know how tightly controlled they were. How tightly they were managing the process. CCS, once they get hired, once they get put in control of these things, they run the meetings. All the ideas that are brought to the table for the stakeholder group to consider are their ideas, and I'll show you what some of those ideas were in a slide or two. Provide all the technical analysis. Everything was their intellectual information feeding into the process, and they always steered it towards 50 or so recommendations that would, basically raise energy costs because of capping greenhouse gas emissions and capping fossil fuel use. The foundation of their work is to not allow any debate or discussion of the climate science. It was off the table. It was not to be allowed. So the recommendations, would feed into new possible executive orders issued by governors, depending on where they were on the political spectrum, or sent over to the legislature saying, it comes over from this objective study commission, and what's a legislator not knowing the background of these things is going to say, oh, well, this is what they think we should do. Maybe we should start writing some laws like renewable portfolio standards. These are some of the groups, I mentioned some of them, who have been funding CCS around the country. They may land in a state like Michigan and get some of the Midwestern foundations that are oriented up there to jump on board. They're very gifted, very able to go to these foundations and get them on board quickly, because you go to these foundation websites and look at their climate page or their environmental page, and it says, this is what we want to do, this is what we fund. So CCS shows up, and easily they get the grant. Sandler is Herb and Marion Sandler. Their foundation worked. That's why I have the word Soros up there. They worked to set up the Center for Public Integrity, the left-leaning think tank in D.C. that's run by John Podesta. And they were big into the subprime financial. They owned Golden West Financial before they sold out, just in the nick of time to Wachovia, and then you saw Wachovia go into the tank. These are some of the other states where they've been. And not all of them have been created through the governors or through the environmental bureaucracy. In Colorado, they went through a nonprofit organization, and so there's lots of different ways they go about it. They just want to get their foot in the door. They want to get this appearance of an objective study commission created so it can have a heavy influence on the policy development. And from what my sources tell me, these two Georgia Tech professors may be working closely with CCS in bringing them in. Judith Curry, as you see, Michael Chang. They've already had CCS here 2 years ago. They had an air quality conference in May 2008, I think it was, and they were very much involved in hosting the discussions, the panels and such. So that's, I don't think your Governor Perdue, we have a Governor Perdue in North Carolina too. Your Governor Perdue this is something that he would go for. Maybe their next governor would and welcome it in. But this is I would say this could be a strong possibility of how they get in here. Excuse me. So these are some of the things that have come out of other study commissions in other states. A lot of them have become law or been enacted. Pay-as-you-drive insurance, pay by the mile, which can be really harmful to a businessman with a fleet of vehicles or businesswoman. You can see some of these other things that basically they're all hidden taxes. They're raising the cost of energy, raising energy rates, and who does that fall on disproportionately? It falls upon the poor. They're the ones who are going to have to really suffer more than anyone else. This is a case that we make on the alarmist side just about everywhere we speak. Even the Congress of Racial Equality is on board saying this is a bad deal for the poor, led by Roy Ennis, who's a former civil rights activist, still is, I should say. So anyway, as Benita said, I testified yesterday on the renewable portfolio standards. So what does CCS, how are we doing on time? I'm almost done. CCS say about its own proposals. When they get all these things done, 50 proposals, if you adopt all these things, this is how wonderful it will be. The recommendation in New Mexico, they said the recommendations are projected to create net economic savings of over $2 billion for the state economy over the period 2007 to 2020. Montana, they said our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020 can be met and exceeded if all recommendations are implemented. You can just have your cake and eat it too. If you do it right, you can save money, create jobs, and cut emissions. Tom Peterson was cited in a newspaper article a couple of years ago. I believe it was in Minnesota. Well, how does that square up with what presidential candidate Obama said last year on the campaign trail in an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle? He said, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Now, I don't know how that comports with saving states net economic savings and, doing things like creating green jobs. This is going to destroy jobs. It's going to destroy, economic development, because if you have to devote more money towards your energy costs and they're necessarily skyrocketing, it's not going to do a whole lot of good for the economy. But that's the picture that Center for Climate Strategy paints. What I've been doing is this independent project, Climate Strategies Watch, and with Heartland, what I've done is these guys finish up in a state and they finish their 50 or so recommendations. I'll go up to my friends at the Beacon Hill Institute in Boston at the Suffolk University up there, PhD economists, really know their stuff, and they peer review their findings and they blast it basically. I mean, these guys do serious work, and they reveal all the flaws in the research and in the so-called economic research that CCS does. They don't take into account all the costs. They don't take into account the jobs that are destroyed. They account for, instead of counting for labor as a cost, they count it as a benefit, and they call it seriously flawed and fictitious analysis. So that is my presentation. That is what you need to be watching out for in the state of Georgia coming down the pike. As Benita mentioned, the last frontier to be conquered with regional efforts, we've got the Western Climate Initiative, you've got the Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Accord, you've got up in the Northeast, you've got the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Last year, Tim Kaine was the chair of the Southern Governors Association. They had their annual meeting in Richmond, Virginia, and 5 of the 6 panels had to do with climate change, with energy, They only had one panel on healthcare, and healthcare was the biggest issue last year. And despite that, you can see where the alarmists. This is the South is the last frontier that they want to conquer for these regions. So they'll have the whole country, and they can put even more pressure on the federal government. With that, I'll take your questions if you have any.
After ClimateGate, how has the mood shifted, not just here in the South, but in these other sections of the country? Have they lost a lot of momentum? Is there any kind of noticeable pushback against these initiatives?
Well, I would say there was pushback before ClimateGate because looking at the polls, Gallup, Rasmussen, Pew, they would, I can't remember which pollster did it this way, but they said, rank your most important issues 1 to 20. And there's been 2 or 3 polls like this now where global warming was last, not important at all. And then there's the polls that say, do you believe it's, and Rasmussen does this poll about every quarter or so, do you believe it's got more to do with planetary, I don't know why he says planetary, but he says it's basically natural causes or is it human cause? And there's more people that are believing that it's natural as opposed to human cause. So you're getting a public blowback. We've seen it in the State of the Union response now. You wouldn't have seen that before ClimateGate. So that's just, ClimateGate has just amplified the skepticism that was already getting stirred up.
But are legislatively, is anything much passing in these states?
Well, it's kind of been stagnating from what this is anecdotal observation. I can't keep track of all 50 states and specifically what they're doing. I mean, anecdotally, I just see a lot more backbone on the conservative side. They're not running scared anymore. They're not acting like they're going to be blamed for being anti-environment, for not supporting climate change. I don't know why this is, but the British media has done a 180, and so often we see the British media leads the American media, and the American media will follow behind. And it's funny, the week after ClimateGate, before ClimateGate, you could not find on any of the networks a debate between a climate scientist, alarmist, and a climate scientist skeptic. And the cable news networks were full of debates after that. That's how far it's come. You cannot say overwhelming scientific consensus anymore without being laughed at. At a minimum, you can't say there's a consensus.
What do you make of the move to establish a global warming department, if you will, under NOAA? Do you see that as an effort to pull global warming activity away from EPA, or what do you think of that?
It seems like a desperation measure to me, and I don't know how long that was in the making. And frankly, it's not something I read up a lot about. I've read, little bits about it. But you mentioned EPA. That's where the danger lies. Is that the EPA has already said that they consider CO2, greenhouse gases, a pollutant. And therefore, under the Clean Air Act from back in the 1970s, they say they have the authority to regulate CO2 emissions. What all of us are exhaling right now, it's a pollutant, and therefore they are going to regulate it, and they're writing the rules to do that right now. That's where the real danger is. And as I was talking to some of your friends here this morning, it's going to get challenged in court. But in the meantime, it's likely to, move forward, and everybody will have to comply. The thing is on that is that the threshold is so low in the Clean Air Act. It was never intended for CO2 emissions. It was intended for real pollutants, particles in the air. And so to take into what's the threshold in the actual act? It's 2,500, and they want to tailor it up to 25,000. 2,500. If you kept it where the law says you have to keep it, it would take into account this building, any large commercial structure. They would all have to go out and get these permits to comply with it. It would be a regulatory nightmare. EPA wants to, so they don't have to deal with it to that level and deal with the blowback on it. They want to make their own law by raising it up to 200, is it, I'm sorry, 25,000. Therefore, it would just only take into account large factories and industrial emitters. So that's the danger now. I really don't think cap and trade is going to get any traction this year, and even after this year, after all this.
Are you familiar with Steve Sondergaard and his book?
No, I'm not.
Climate Balance, a balanced and realistic view of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
He tells me he gave one to your James Taylor. Is that
Yeah, James is my colleague at the Heartland Institute.
Yeah.
Heartland's people are all over the country, and James is in Florida. I'm work out of Raleigh. I don't know where he would have run into James. James speaks all over the place as well.
Denver, I think it was.
Yep. James has been there a few times.
I'll get your business card when I leave. Interested. He takes a proposal here of having identified so much that is on one side and so much is on the other side. And personally, I guess my view is I find both sides difficult to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think and I guess my question there of you, sure, I think you're making a very strong case here, and this worries me a lot. But I think that we hear so much. I'm not sure that there's any more scientific basis by a lot of what is used to refute that. I think yours is certainly there, but I think there are others.
Well, thank you.
I think there are certainly others where that came. It seems to me we need to find an avenue kind of in the middle. I don't mean a line there. I mean, there is reason for a debate here. There certainly are some issues and challenges and things of good sense that we ought to be doing differently, but we seem unable to discuss any of those things. Just your views on that.
Well, the theme for so long that the media has controlled has been it's consensus. There's no argument to be had. Al Gore won't debate. James Hansen at NASA will not debate. Debate about what? And they approach it like giving too much credibility to the skeptic side, and so the ClimateGate has revealed, at least, if nothing else, that there is a debate. There are a lot of scientists. There's the Oregon Petition Project, which has been signed by 31,000 scientists. Not all, they're not called climate scientists. I admit they're not all. They've all got science degrees of one type or another.
But
You've
they
got
have a concern for the application of the scientific method,
right,
which seems to be lacking here.
Right.
So I think that's really what their benefit
right.
is.
It's clear from what we've discovered from ClimateGate that they had an agenda, that they were citing advocacy groups, papers, press releases, dissertations that were not the scientific method, the appropriate scientific method to be followed, contrary to what they were telling us was done. They were caught in a lie.
In this church of the climate change believers, have there been any apostates, any people that were prominent in this movement that have blown the whistle and on all the intellectual dishonesty?
Well, maybe the guy or the gal who got the emails exposed.
Has that person been identified?
No. Well, some people, the alarmists want you to think it was stolen. These were private emails, and it was some nefarious act that and it was put up on this Russian server, and they just stole into our private communication, jumped into our private communication. I don't know. Skeptics are saying you could have been a whistleblower. How do you get this perfectly packaged group of emails that have such specific information put up on a server? How would a hacker have gotten in at that and found that perfect? They were it has to be that they were preparing for a FOIA. They didn't want to release it, a FOIA meaning a Freedom of Information Act response. They were ready to do it, and maybe something internally at this climatic research unit, they weren't going to do it, and this whistleblower had a conscience. Obviously, I'm speculating. I don't know what happened, but it looks very suspicious. So, and this could have been a person inside. I'm trying to think of anybody else who's James. Can you think of anybody who's kind of turned on? I mean, there's been a number of scientists, none that I can think of that are prominent.
People all the way from Australia, all around the globe, who turned against it. In fact, the first person from Australia, the PhD, who wrote their guide for their government 10 years ago, was completely flipped on it. I think we missed the boat in trying to get about what quantities here, there, and yonder. When you look at it, all the CO2 in the atmosphere produced by mankind, by whatever fuel we burn or don't burn, is less than 0.1% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. You don't have to go to Harvard or Tech even to figure out there's one mechanical way that could be an impact of any kind. It just doesn't make sense. And when you look into it deeply, the 13 different computer programs that they have about the components, not one term in any one of them has a thing to do with the effect of the sun on the earth. Not one. All the energy on the earth virtually came from the sun and still does.
Right, and that Willie Soon, who's an astrophysicist at Harvard, does a lot of research on that aspect of it. Last thing to answer another answer to your question, William Spriggs was one of the he had a role in the first IPCC report. He just spoke at a conference out in Energy and Environment conference out in Phoenix a week or two ago. James Taylor was there and recorded his presentation. He is an alarmist. He's on the side of believing CO2 is doing this, causing this predominantly, or it's going to lead to big problems. He said there's a problem with IPCC. There is needs to be more transparency in the science. And that video of his whole presentation is on Heartland's website, so you could go watch that for yourself.
Bjorn Lomborg.
Bjorn Lomborg, another believer in that CO2 is a problem and an issue, says he's an economist. He looks at what's the cost benefit. All these billions and maybe trillions of dollars that they're pouring into research, to mitigation, to capping emissions. This is money down a rat hole compared to. He's got a project called Copenhagen Challenge where they look at, well, what if we took that money and put it into adaptation if there is a problem with, say, sea level rise, or if it's the other problems in the world such as AIDS or poverty, those kinds of things. So that's the case that he makes.
Well, thank you all so much. One thing I know about the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's luncheon events is that we have some really exciting guests who you may not believe everything they say all the time, but we certainly do leave you with food for thought. And I hope you watch your emails. I hope you leave your card. If you are not on our mailing list yet, leave your card on the table and we'll add you to our mailing list for our next events. And I want to thank Paul again for a great presentation and the information.